Philosophical question: does the forge of conflict reveal the true measure of a people, or does it merely consume them? The year is 1911, in the sun-drenched emerald-hued village of An Shah, nestled within the Quang Bien province of French Indochina. A child was born who would, in time, become an architect of revolution, a general of unparalleled will. His name was Võ Nguyên Giáp. The world into which he arrived was one of profound subjugation, a land under the heavy thumb of French colonial rule, where the very air seemed to hum with the unspoken indignities of foreign domination. For decades, France had systematically dismantled the ancient Vietnamese imperial system, replacing it with an administration designed for extraction, not development. Plantations sprawled across the landscape, churning out rubber, rice, and coal, all destined for European markets. The local populace, the very people whose land this was, toiled under harsh conditions, their lives circumscribed by the dictates of their colonial masters. Taxes were levied with ruthless efficiency. Education was a privilege reserved for a select few, and any whisper of dissent was met with swift, brutal suppression. Võ Nguyên Giap's family, while not wealthy, belonged to the scholarly tradition, a lineage that valued intellect and resistance. His father, Võ Quang Giam, was a devoted Confucian scholar and a patriot who had participated in the Can Vuong movement, a late 19th century armed resistance against French rule led by Emperor Himni. These were not mere historical footnotes. To the young Giap, they were living narratives, whispered tales of courage and defiance that shaped his nascent understanding of the world. He grew up hearing of the failed uprisings, the sacrifices, and the enduring dream of an independent Vietnam. This personal connection to a legacy of resistance would prove formative. The philosophical undercurrent of this struggle, the clash between the desire for self-determination and the crushing weight of foreign power, began to seep into his consciousness. Early on, Giap displayed a remarkable intellectual prowess. His mind was sharp, inquisitive, and absorbed knowledge like a sponge. He attended the prestigious Quec HCC, a French-language secondary school in Hue, the former imperial capital. This was an institution designed to cultivate a Vietnamese elite loyal to French interests, yet it inadvertently became a crucible for nationalist sentiment. Within its hallowed halls, young Vietnamese intellectuals, exposed to Enlightenment ideals and the histories of other colonized nations, began to question the legitimacy of French rule. Giap excelled in his studies, particularly history and law, subjects that provided him with a deeper understanding of power dynamics and the historical precedents for resistance. It was here, in the intellectual ferment of Quec HCC, that the seeds of his future revolutionary path were truly sown. His time at Quec HCC was not without incident. Giap was expelled in 1927 for his involvement in student protests against French policies. This expulsion, far from deterring him, ignited a fiercer resolve. He gravitated towards revolutionary student movements, becoming an active participant in the clandestine activities aimed at undermining colonial authority. He distributed nationalist leaflets, attended secret meetings, and engaged in heated debates about the future of Vietnam. These experiences were crucial. They moved him beyond theoretical understanding into the realm of direct action. Forging his commitment to the nationalist cause, he witnessed firsthand the courage of his peers, the risks they took, and the harsh reprisals they faced. The cost of resistance was starkly apparent, yet the conviction for freedom burned brighter. By the early 1930s, the political landscape of Vietnam was a complex tapestry of emerging nationalist groups, some advocating for reform, others for armed struggle. Among these was the Indochinese Communist Party, founded by Ho Chi Minh in Ijo Sanling. Giap, drawn by its anti-colonial stance and its promise of a more equitable society, joined the party in 1931. This was a pivotal moment. His intellectual leanings found a concrete ideological framework, and his desire for action found an organized, disciplined outlet. The party, though small and constantly under French surveillance, offered a vision for a truly independent Vietnam, free from both colonial and feudal oppression. It was a vision that resonated deeply with Giap's innate sense of justice and his profound patriotism. He began writing for revolutionary newspapers, using his formidable intellect to articulate the grievances of the Vietnamese people and to rally support for the nationalist cause. His articles, often written under pseudonyms, dissected colonial policies with surgical precision, and called for national liberation. This period was one of intense intellectual and political development for Giap, transforming him from a bright student into a committed revolutionary. He was not yet a general, not yet a strategist of global renown, but the foundations of that future were being meticulously laid, brick by painful brick, in the crucible of colonial oppression. Would you remember them? The political landscape in Vietnam grew increasingly volatile through the 1930s. French authorities, keenly aware of the rising nationalist tide, intensified their efforts to suppress any form of organized dissent. Arrests, detentions, and executions became commonplace. For Võ Nguyên Giáp, this period was marked by constant vigilance and the ever-present threat of imprisonment. Yet, it was also a time of profound learning and ideological hardening. He delved deeper into Marxist-Leninist theory, finding in its tenets a powerful framework for analyzing colonial exploitation and a roadmap for revolutionary change. He studied the histories of other anti-colonial struggles, seeking insights and strategies that could be adapted to the Vietnamese context. His intellect, already formidable, was sharpened by the urgency of his convictions and the perilous environment in which he operated. During these years, Giap also embarked on a career as a history teacher at Thang Long School in Hanoi. This was more than just a profession. It was a strategic platform. Through his lectures, he not only imparted historical knowledge, but also subtly infused his students with a sense of national pride and a critical perspective on French rule. He emphasized the long, storied history of Vietnamese resistance against foreign invaders, from Chinese dynasties to the burgeoning French presence. He spoke of legendary figures who had defied overwhelming odds, instilling in his young charges a sense of their own heritage and potential for future liberation. These lessons, cloaked in academic discourse, were in fact lessons in revolutionary thought, nurturing a new generation of patriots. His classroom became a quiet, unofficial breeding ground for nationalist sentiment, a testament to his ability to inspire and educate, even under the watchful eyes of the colonial regime. The year 1939 marked a significant turning point, not just for Vietnam, but for the entire world. The outbreak of World War II in Europe drastically altered the geopolitical landscape. France, now embroiled in a desperate struggle against Nazi Germany, found its grip on its colonial possessions weakening. In September 1940, Japan, aligning itself with the Axis powers, invaded French Indochina, effectively taking control of the region. Though nominally allowing the French colonial administration to remain, this dual occupation, Japanese military presence layered over weakened French authority, created a power vacuum and a complex new dynamic for Vietnamese revolutionaries. It presented both an immense challenge and an unprecedented opportunity. For Giap and his comrades, the Japanese invasion was a brutal reminder of foreign domination, but also a moment to intensify their clandestine activities. They recognized that the conflict between the Japanese and the French, two occupying powers, could be exploited. The time for passive resistance was over. The moment for armed struggle was drawing near. In May 1941, a crucial meeting was held in Pc Bo, a remote cave in Cao Bang province, near the Chinese border. It was at this meeting that H. Chi Minh, who had returned to Vietnam after 3 decades of exile, convened the 8th plenum of the Communist Party of Indochina. Here, the decision was made to form the Viet Nam GCLP Hon Minh Hai, or the League for the Independence of Vietnam, more commonly known as the Viet Minh. Võ Nguyên Giáp was present at this historic meeting. He was entrusted by H. Chi Minh with a monumental task to establish and lead the armed propaganda teams, the nascent military arm of the Viet Minh. This was a radical shift for Giap. Up until this point, his activism had been primarily intellectual and political. Now, he was being asked to build an army from scratch, to transform theoretical principles of guerrilla warfare into practical, actionable strategies. He had no formal military training, no experience leading troops in combat. Yet, H. Minh saw in him not just intellectual brilliance, but also an unwavering determination, a meticulous mind, and an extraordinary capacity for organization. Giap accepted the challenge with characteristic resolve, understanding the immense stakes involved. The task was daunting. The initial armed propaganda units were tiny, often consisting of only a handful of men and women, poorly equipped, and operating in the most remote, rugged terrain. Their weapons were often rudimentary, old muskets, homemade grenades, or even just farm tools. Their uniform was the black pajamas of the peasantry, but what they lacked in material resources, they compensated for with ideological fervor and an intimate knowledge of the local terrain. Giap began by recruiting peasants and ethnic minority groups from the northern highlands. Drawing on their deep resentment of both French and Japanese rule, he instilled in them a clear purpose: to fight for national liberation. He understood that the people were the sea in which the guerrillas would swim, and without their support, no armed struggle could succeed. He meticulously studied military tactics, poring over texts on guerrilla warfare, absorbing lessons from past rebellions and contemporary conflicts. He learned by doing, adapting his strategies to the harsh realities of the Vietnamese countryside. The initial objective was not large-scale conventional combat, but rather to conduct propaganda, establish popular bases, and engage in small disruptive actions to harass the Japanese and French. These were the very first steps in the arduous journey toward building a modern army, led by a man who would, against all odds, become one of history's most successful military commanders. Now that you know, what will you do with it? The initial years of the Viet Minh's armed struggle, from 1941 to 1944, were a period of intense hardship and relentless foundational work for Vien Nguyen Giap, operating in the remote mountainous regions of northern Vietnam, particularly in the provinces of Cao Ban, Lang Sen, and Bia Kien. Giap and his small bands of fighters faced immense challenges. The terrain was unforgiving, food was scarce, and the threat of French and Japanese patrols was constant. Yet, it was in this crucible of adversity that Giap honed his understanding of guerrilla warfare and the critical importance of popular support. He spent countless hours among the local communities, especially the ethnic minority peoples like the Tay, Anangi, and Tao, who inhabited these highlands. He learned their customs, understood their grievances, and tirelessly propagated the Viet Minh's message of national liberation. Giap's approach was characterized by meticulous planning and an unwavering focus on political education. He understood that military action alone was insufficient. The hearts and minds of the people had to be won. His armed propaganda teams did exactly as their name suggested. They engaged in small-scale military actions, ambushes, sabotage, intelligence gathering, but simultaneously conducted political education among the villagers. They helped peasants with their harvests, offered medical assistance, and explained the goals of the revolution. This combination of military action and social engagement built trust and loyalty, creating a network of support that would prove invaluable. Villagers provided food, shelter, intelligence, and recruits, forming the very backbone of the burgeoning movement. Giap recognized that true power lay not just in weapons, but in the people's active participation and commitment. On December 22, 1944, a pivotal moment occurred. Under H. Khai Minh's directive, V. Nguyen Giap officially established the Vietnam Propaganda and Liberation Army (VPLA) in a dense forest in Cao Ban. This small force, initially comprising only 34 men and 2 rudimentary revolvers, along with a handful of old rifles and flintlocks, represented the genesis of what would become the People's Army of Vietnam. Giap famously declared, "Politics is more important than military action. The army must be the people's army." This declaration underscored his core philosophy. The military was a tool for political objectives, and its strength derived from its connection to the populace. The VPLA's first 2 engagements, 2 days after its formation, were against isolated French outposts, Phi Cot and Nann. These were small victories, strategically chosen to boost morale and demonstrate the VPLA's capability. Even if limited, they were psychological triumphs more than military ones, announcing the emergence of a new force. The end of World War II in August 1945 brought about a seismic shift. Japan, defeated, surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. This created a power vacuum in Vietnam. The French, weakened by the war and the Japanese occupation, were not yet in a position to reassert full control. H. Chu Minh and the Viet Minh seized this fleeting opportunity. Giap, now commanding a rapidly growing force, led his units in what became known as the August Revolution. This was not a conventional military campaign, but a synchronized national uprising. Viet Minh forces, alongside popular militias, moved swiftly to take control of key cities and administrative centers across Vietnam, often facing minimal resistance from the disoriented Japanese or the absent French. On September 2, 1945, in Hanoi SPA, in H Square, Ho Chi Minh, read the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, formally proclaiming Vietnam's independence from France and Japan. Võ Nguyên Giáp stood beside him as this historic declaration echoed across the square. It was a moment of immense triumph, the culmination of decades of struggle and sacrifice. For a brief, exhilarating period, it seemed as though the dream of a free and independent Vietnam had finally been realized. Giáp, the teacher and intellectual, had played a critical role in transforming a clandestine political movement into a force capable of seizing national power. He had built an army not from grand academies and endless resources, but from the will of the people and the unforgiving lessons of the jungle. However, this newfound independence was precarious. The Allied powers, particularly Britain and China, began to move into Vietnam to disarm the Japanese. In the south, British forces facilitated the return of the French, who were determined to re-establish their colonial rule. In the north, Chinese nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek occupied the territory, initially posing another complex challenge to the Viet Minh's authority. The Declaration of Independence, while powerful and symbolic, did not automatically confer sovereignty. The stage was set for a renewed, more intense conflict, as France, with Allied backing, began to exert pressure to reclaim its former colony. The Vietnamese people, having tasted freedom, were not prepared to relinquish it without a fight. And the Viet Minh understood that the true struggle for independence was only just beginning, and that the path ahead would be fraught with even greater peril than the one they had just traversed. Would you remember them? The Declaration of Independence on September 2, 1945, ignited hope across Vietnam, but this hope was immediately challenged by the grim realities of post-war geopolitics. France, devastated by World War II but emboldened by Allied support, was determined to reclaim its jewel in the crown, Indochina. For Võ Nguyên Giáp and Ho Chi Minh, the immediate priority shifted from seizing power to defending it against a technologically superior adversary. The French, under General Leclerc, began to re-enter Vietnam, initially establishing a foothold. In the south, their strategy was clear: reoccupy key urban centers, secure vital infrastructure, and gradually extend their control over the entire country. Ho Chi Minh, a master of diplomacy and strategy, initially sought a peaceful resolution. He engaged in negotiations with the French, hoping to secure a degree of autonomy or independence through political means. Understanding that the nascent Democratic Republic of Vietnam was militarily weak, in March 1946, the Ho Chi Minh Agreement was signed, in which France recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a free state within the French Union, with its own army and parliament. However, this agreement was a temporary truce at best, a strategic maneuver by both sides to gain time. The French interpreted Free State very differently from the Vietnamese, viewing it as a concession that would eventually lead to reintegration into the French colonial empire. The Vietnamese saw it as a stepping stone towards full independence. Recognizing the inherent duplicity, while diplomatic efforts unfolded, Giáp understood that the ultimate arbiter would be military strength. He threw himself into the monumental task of transforming the Viet Minh's guerrilla units into a more formidable fighting force. This was a period of intense organizational activity. He established military academies, albeit rudimentary ones, to train officers and non-commissioned officers. He sought to standardize training, discipline, and logistics. Weapons remained a major challenge. The Viet Minh relied on captured Japanese arms, outdated French rifles, and increasingly, aid from sympathetic sources in China. Giáp personally oversaw training exercises, emphasizing the principles of people's war, political indoctrination, self-sufficiency, mobility, and the art of striking when strong and melting away when weak. He understood that a direct confrontation with the well-equipped French would be suicidal. Instead, he planned for a prolonged attritional conflict that would exhaust the colonial power. Tensions escalated rapidly throughout 1946. French forces, despite the Ho Chi Minh Agreement, continued to consolidate their positions, particularly in the south. Incidents multiplied, often sparked by French attempts to reassert control in areas where the Viet Minh held sway. The diplomatic facade began to crack under the weight of these military realities. Giap, meanwhile, was preparing for the inevitable. He directed the relocation of key personnel and resources from urban areas to the remote, defensible Viet Bse region, the mountainous stronghold that had been the birthplace of the Viet Minh. This strategic withdrawal was crucial, ensuring that the movement would have a secure base from which to wage a prolonged war. He ordered the construction of hidden supply depots, training camps, and communication networks, preparing the ground for a protracted struggle. The point of no return arrived in November 1946. French naval forces, under the pretext of a customs dispute, bombarded the port city of Haiphong, causing thousands of Vietnamese civilian casualties. This brutal act shattered any remaining illusions of peaceful coexistence. It was a clear demonstration of French resolve to impose their will through force. Ho Chi Minh, recognizing that further negotiation was futile, issued a nationwide appeal for resistance on December 19, 1946. His words resonated across the country. Those who have rifles will use their rifles. Those who have swords will use their swords. Those who have no swords will use spades, hoes, or sticks. This marked the official beginning of the First Indochina War. Hanoi, the capital, became the immediate battleground. GOP's forces, despite being heavily outmatched in terms of firepower, waged a desperate, determined defense of the city. They employed street-to-street fighting, ambushes, and booby traps, attempting to inflict maximum casualties on the French and slow their advance. This urban combat, while ultimately unsuccessful in holding the city, served a critical purpose. It allowed the main Viet Minh forces and the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to safely withdraw to the Viet Bse. The defense of Hanoi was a strategic sacrifice, buying invaluable time for the nascent state to regroup and establish its wartime infrastructure. Giap proved himself an adaptable commander, transitioning from guerrilla raids to the more complex operations of defending a city, even if temporarily. The retreat from Hanoi was not a defeat in the strategic sense. It was a calculated move to preserve the core of the resistance. The long, brutal war for independence had truly begun, and Giap, the architect of this emerging army, stood at its forefront, facing an enemy that held every conventional advantage. Share this, if you would have opened the gate. With the retreat from Hanoi in December 1946, V. Nguyen Giap and the core of the Viet Minh leadership, including Ho Chi Minh, established their primary base of operations in the Viet Bse region. This vast, rugged expanse of mountains, dense forests, and hidden valleys in northern Vietnam became the strategic heartland of the resistance. It was a natural fortress, difficult for the French to penetrate, and intimately known to the Viet Minh guerrillas. Here, Giap set about transforming his fledgling army into a force capable of protracted war. The initial years of the First Indochina War, from late 1946 through 1949, were characterized by a grim struggle for survival, a testament to the Viet Minh's resilience and Giap's strategic foresight. The French, confident in their superior firepower and logistical capabilities, believed they could swiftly crush the rebellion. Their strategy revolved around re-establishing control over the Red River Delta and other economically vital areas, securing major communication routes, and launching search and destroy operations into the Viet Bse to eliminate the Viet Minh leadership and their bases. They deployed sophisticated weaponry, including tanks, artillery, and air power, against an enemy often armed with scavenged rifles and a deep knowledge of the terrain. However, Giap understood that conventional warfare favored the French. His strategy was one of protracted people's war, a concept refined by Mao Zedong and adapted to the Vietnamese context. It emphasized wearing down the enemy over time, preserving one's own forces, and building political support among the population. Under Giap's direction, the Viet Minh organized itself into a three-tiered structure: the regular army, regional forces, and local militias. The regular army was composed of full-time soldiers, trained for larger, coordinated engagements when opportunities arose. Regional forces operated within specific provinces, defending their areas and supporting the regulars. Local militias, the broadest base, consisted of part-time fighters, often farmers by day, who provided intelligence, transport, and engaged in local harassment. This layered approach ensured that the French faced resistance at every level, From ambushes on isolated roads to sabotage in occupied towns, Giap emphasized decentralization, empowering local commanders to act independently within the broader strategic framework. Logistics in the Viet BSC were a constant, Herculean challenge. The Viet Minh relied heavily on the support of the local population for food, shelter, and intelligence. The famous bicycle brigades, where thousands of civilians transported supplies on reinforced bicycles, became a symbol of the war effort. These humble conveyances could carry hundreds of kilograms of rice, ammunition, and other vital supplies over treacherous jungle trails, often under enemy fire. Giap understood that the success of his army hinged not just on combat prowess, but on the ability to sustain itself in a hostile environment. Drawing strength from the deep wells of popular support, he meticulously planned supply routes, established hidden storage depots, and ensured that the needs of the fighting units were met. However meagerly, the French launched several large-scale offensives into the Viet BSC, most notably Operation Lee in October 1947. This ambitious operation aimed to encircle and destroy the Viet Minh High Command and their main forces. French paratroopers were dropped deep into the jungle, while ground columns pushed in from multiple directions. For a moment, the Viet Minh leadership was indeed imperiled. However, Giap's forces, through their intimate knowledge of the terrain, superior mobility, and the invaluable intelligence provided by the local population, managed to evade the French trap. They melted into the jungle, launched counterattacks on French flanks, and continuously harassed their supply lines. Operation Lee, despite its initial promise, ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. The Viet Minh leadership escaped, and their main forces remained intact. This failure was a crucial psychological victory for the Viet Minh and a stark demonstration to the French that conventional military might alone would not secure victory against a determined popular resistance. Giap's leadership during this period was characterized by his rigorous discipline, his capacity for strategic thought, and his unyielding commitment to the cause. He spent countless hours poring over maps, analyzing intelligence, and planning operations. He demanded high standards from his commanders and instilled a deep sense of ideological purpose in his troops. Despite the constant pressure and limited resources, he focused on continuous improvement, learning from every engagement, whether successful or not. The Viet BSC became more than just a military base. It transformed into a functioning state, complete with rudimentary administrative structures, schools, and hospitals, all operating under the constant threat of French assault. The philosophical question of whether conflict consumes or reveals the measure of a people echoed through these trying years. In the Viet BSC, amidst the privation and the fighting, the Vietnamese people, under Giap's steady hand, were indeed revealing their measure. Would you ever retreat? As the 1940s drew to a close, the geopolitical landscape surrounding the First Indochina War underwent a significant transformation, profoundly impacting the trajectory of the conflict and bolstering Võ Nguyên Giap's strategic capabilities. The victory of Mao Zedong's communist forces in China in October 1949 was a watershed moment. Suddenly, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, previously isolated, gained a powerful ideological ally and a direct, secure border with a communist nation. This eliminated the geographical constraints that had long hampered the Viet Minh's ability to receive external support. China immediately became a crucial lifeline. For the first time, the Viet Minh could access a consistent flow of military aid, including modern weaponry, ammunition, and technical assistance. Chinese military advisors, many with extensive experience in guerrilla warfare against the Japanese and the Kuomintang, began to train Viet Minh cadre. This influx of resources and expertise was precisely what Giap needed to transition his forces from pure guerrilla units to more conventional, mobile formations, capable of larger-scale engagements. He eagerly absorbed the lessons from the Chinese Civil War, adapting them to the specific conditions of Vietnam. The impact was almost immediate. Viet Minh units began to show greater professionalism, discipline, and firepower. With newfound confidence and increased military strength, Giap launched a series of offensives along the Vietnamese-Chinese border in late 1949 and early 1950. These were collectively known as the Border Campaign Chinh Dutch Bien. The objective was to clear French strongholds along the frontier, secure the supply lines from China, and consolidate control over the Viet BSE. The campaign began with the attack on Hong Kong, a heavily fortified French outpost. After a grueling and fierce battle, the Viet Minh, employing tactics of siege warfare and human wave assaults, captured the position. This victory forced the French to withdraw from other key border forts, including Cao Bun Dien, in a series of chaotic and costly retreats. The border campaign was a resounding success for the Viet Minh and a catastrophic defeat for the French. It demonstrated that GIOP's forces were no longer just a collection of ragtag guerrillas. They could now conduct coordinated large unit operations, overwhelm French fortifications, and inflict significant casualties. The French lost vast quantities of equipment and suffered thousands of casualties, demoralizing their expeditionary corps. Crucially, the campaign opened up a secure corridor to China, ensuring the uninterrupted flow of supplies and personnel. This strategic victory fundamentally altered the balance of power, forcing France to reassess its military strategy and acknowledge the growing sophistication of its adversary. In response to the Viet Minh's growing strength and the strategic shift, France appointed General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny as Commander-in-Chief of French forces in Indochina in December 1950. De Lattre was a highly respected and energetic commander, tasked with restoring French morale and turning the tide of the war. He immediately set about fortifying the Red River Delta, constructing a vast network of bunkers, outposts, and defensive lines known as the De Lattre Line, designed to protect Hanoi and the vital Delta region from Viet Minh incursions. He also launched aggressive pacification campaigns and sought to win over the Vietnamese population through political reforms and the establishment of a Vietnamese national army, hoping to create a viable alternative to the Viet Minh GIOP. Observing De Lattre's efforts, recognized the new challenges. The fortified De Lattre Line presented a formidable obstacle to his traditional hit-and-run tactics. In late 1950 and early 1951, GIOP made a tactical error, attempting to launch large-scale conventional assaults against the De Lattre Line at Van Nuys and later at Mau Ca and in the Red River Delta. These battles, notably the Battle of Van Nuys, resulted in heavy Viet Minh casualties. GIOP's forces, while improving, were not yet ready to overcome well-entrenched French defenses, supported by artillery and air power. De Lattre's aggressive defense inflicted significant losses on the Viet Minh, forcing GIOP to reconsider his approach. These defeats were harsh lessons, but GIOP, ever the learner, absorbed them. He recognized the folly of direct confrontation when the enemy held superior firepower and fortified positions. This period reinforced his belief in adapting strategy. Two circumstances, emphasizing the need for overwhelming local superiority and meticulous planning before engaging the enemy. The war, by 1951, had settled into a brutal stalemate, with both sides consolidating their positions and preparing for the next, decisive phase. The origins of Võ Nguyên Giap's journey, from scholar to revolutionary, unfolded amidst the oppressive weight of colonialism and the forging fires of early resistance. He built an army from nothing, fueled by the will of his people and tempered by adversity. The philosophical question, does the forge of conflict reveal the true measure of a people, or does it merely consume them, echoes through these initial years. For the Vietnamese, it revealed an unyielding determination, a spirit of profound resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. GIOP was not just a leader of men, but a reflection of this national resolve. Now that you understand the genesis, would you have chosen to fight? Philosophical question, at what cost does victory come, and who bears the true burden of its price? The early 1950s saw the First Indochina War settle into a grinding, brutal stalemate. After the costly frontal assaults against the French De La Line in Ijo Wu Yi, Võ Nguyên Giáp, ever the pragmatic strategist, pulled back his forces. He meticulously analyzed the defeats at Van Nuys and Mau Ca, concluding that the Viet Minh lacked the necessary firepower and logistical capabilities to overcome well-fortified French positions in conventional assaults. This was a critical moment of adaptation for GIOP. He reverted to the core tenets of protracted people's war, emphasizing guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run raids, and the continuous building of political support among the rural population. He understood that patience and attrition were their greatest weapons against a technologically superior, but ultimately resource-limited, colonial power. GIOP focused on strengthening the Viet Minh's logistical backbone, refining supply lines through the dense jungles and over treacherous mountains. The network of human porters, often women and children, and the ubiquitous bicycle brigades, became even more vital. They transported food, ammunition, and medical supplies, often under arduous conditions and the constant threat of French air reconnaissance. He also deepened the political education of his troops, emphasizing discipline, self-sacrifice, and the unwavering belief in the cause of national liberation. Giap understood that the ideological commitment of his soldiers was as crucial as their weaponry. He also dedicated significant effort to improving the training of his officers and cadres, learning from Chinese advisors and adapting their methods to the unique Vietnamese context. Meanwhile, the French High Command, despite the initial successes of General de Lattre de Tassigny, faced mounting challenges. The financial and human cost of the war was escalating, placing a severe strain on a post-war France still recovering from World War II. Public opinion at home grew increasingly weary of the seemingly endless conflict. De Lattre's health deteriorated, and he was replaced by a succession of commanders, none of whom could fundamentally alter the strategic dynamic. The French found themselves bogged down in a colonial war, fighting an elusive enemy deeply embedded within the population. Their strategy of holding fixed positions and launching conventional offensives proved largely ineffective against Giap's mobile and adaptive forces. The year 1953 brought a significant strategic shift from the French side. Recognizing the limitations of their defensive posture, the new French commander, General Henry Navarre, devised a bold plan. The Navarre plan aimed to regain the initiative by creating a strong, mobile striking force, while simultaneously establishing a heavily fortified base in a remote, strategically important location to lure the Viet Minh into a decisive conventional battle, where French air power and artillery superiority could be leveraged. Navarre believed that a crushing defeat of the Viet Minh's main forces would break their will to fight and allow France to achieve a favorable political settlement. The location chosen for this decisive confrontation was Yan Bien Phaich, a remote valley in the northwestern Tonkin region near the Laotian border. French paratroopers seized the valley in November 1953 and immediately began constructing a series of heavily fortified strike points, complete with runways for air supply and close air support. Navarre envisioned Yan Bien Phaich as an air base, a formidable anchor that would disrupt Viet Minh supply lines to Laos and serve as an irresistible bait for Giap's main forces. The French believed the Viet Minh lacked the heavy artillery and logistical capabilities to besiege such a strong point, and that the surrounding mountainous terrain would prevent them from bringing sufficient force to bear. This overconfidence would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Võ Nguyên Giáp, observing the French build-up at Yan Bien Phaich, recognized the immense risk but also the unprecedented opportunity. This was the conventional battle he had both avoided and prepared for. He understood that if the Viet Minh could destroy this heavily fortified base, it would be a devastating blow to French morale and military power, potentially forcing them to withdraw from Vietnam altogether. However, the challenges were immense. Yan Bien Phaich was deep in hostile territory, far from Viet Minh's supply lines. The French possessed superior air power, and the terrain made it exceedingly difficult to move heavy equipment, particularly artillery, into position. The decision to commit the bulk of the Viet Minh's main forces to a direct assault on such a strong point was the most daring and risky strategic gamble of Giap's career. It would demand unprecedented logistical effort, unparalleled human sacrifice, and a masterclass in military deception and organization. The cost of failure would be catastrophic, but the prize of victory, the end of colonial rule, was immeasurable. Would you have taken the bait? Võ Nguyên Giap's decision to commit to the siege of Yan Bien Phaich was not made lightly. He convened a series of intense meetings with his high command, meticulously analyzing intelligence, terrain, and the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. His initial assessment, influenced by his earlier failed attempts against the de Lattre line, leaned towards a swift assault, a quick strike, quick victory approach. This would have involved overwhelming the French positions with human wave attacks. However, as the logistical challenges became clearer and the sheer strength of the French fortifications became evident, Giap began to have profound reservations. The French had indeed transformed the Yan Bien Phaich Valley into a formidable fortress. They built a central airfield, crucial for air resupply and reinforcement, surrounded by a complex of entrenched strongpoints, each named after a woman: Eliane, Claudine, Huguette, Gabrielle, Beatrice, Isabel. These positions were protected by barbed wire, mines, and mutually supporting fields of fire. The French High Command was confident that their artillery, superior air power, and the rugged terrain surrounding the valley would prevent the Viet Minh from deploying heavy guns or launching a sustained attack. They saw Yan Binh Phaich as an impregnable trap. Giap, however, was not only a strategist, but also a keen observer of human nature and logistics. He listened intently to his advisors, especially those who had reconnoitered the area extensively. He also considered the potential for catastrophic losses if a quick strike failed. After much deliberation, and reportedly after a sleepless night of intense reflection, Giap made one of the most critical decisions of the war. He ordered a complete change in strategy from quick strike, quick victory to prolonged attack, prolonged siege. This meant withdrawing Viet Minh forces that were already in attack positions, redeploying artillery, and preparing for a methodical, grinding siege designed to wear down the French. It was an immensely difficult and controversial decision, defying the initial expectations of his own staff and requiring a Herculean logistical effort. But it proved to be a stroke of strategic genius. The shift to a prolonged siege necessitated an unparalleled logistical undertaking. Giap's primary challenge was to bring heavy artillery to bear on the French positions, hidden from air observation, and to sustain his entire army, numbering tens of thousands, in a remote, mountainous area for months. Thousands of civilian porters, primarily women and ethnic minorities, were mobilized. They dismantled artillery pieces, including Soviet-supplied 105mm howitzers and Katyusha rockets, and manually hauled them, piece by painstaking piece, through dense jungle and up steep mountain slopes. Roads were built and maintained under constant threat of French air attacks. The guns were then reassembled in camouflaged positions, dug deep into the hillsides, making them virtually invisible to French aerial reconnaissance and impervious to counter-battery fire. This was a testament to the ingenuity and sheer human will of the Vietnamese people. In addition to artillery, vast quantities of food, ammunition, and medical supplies had to be transported over hundreds of kilometers. The bicycle brigades, now numbering in the tens of thousands, tirelessly ferried supplies along a network of hidden trails. This logistical network, dubbed the Iron Road, became the lifeblood of the Viet Minh effort. Giap understood that the battle would not be won by firepower alone, but by the ability to sustain his forces and deny the French their air superiority. Anti-aircraft batteries, also hauled through the jungle, were strategically placed to protect the supply lines and challenge French air superiority over the valley, thereby making resupply for the French increasingly perilous. Giap's forces began digging an elaborate network of trenches that slowly but surely encircled the French positions. These trenches were not just for combat, they were logistical, arteries allowing the safe movement of troops, supplies, and even heavy weapons closer to the French perimeter. Shielded from French artillery and air attacks, the Viet Minh engineers constructed underground bunkers and command posts, creating a subterranean world around Yan Binh Phaich. This meticulous preparation, this slow, deliberate tightening of the noose, took months, pushing the French High Command into a state of increasingly desperate anxiety. The French, isolated in their valley stronghold, underestimated the scale of the Viet Minh's logistical feat and the tactical brilliance of Giap's planning. They believed their air superiority and formidable defenses would deter any sustained assault. This hubris, combined with Giap's strategic patience and the Vietnamese people's immense sacrifice, set the stage for one of the most decisive battles of the 20th century. What personal sacrifice would you make for such a cause? On March 13, 1954, the long, meticulous preparations of Vien Nguyen Giap and the Viet Minh culminated in the opening salvos of the Battle of Yan Binh Phaich. At 5 p.m., a massive artillery bombardment, unprecedented in the First Indochina War, began to rain down on the French strongpoint of Beatrice. The sheer volume and accuracy of the Viet Minh fire stunned the French defenders. They had been convinced that Giap lacked the heavy artillery, and even if he possessed it, that he could not deploy and conceal it effectively in the rugged terrain. The reality was a terrifying shock. The well-camouflaged 105mm howitzers and Other guns, meticulously dragged into position and dug deep into the hillsides, unleashed a devastating barrage that quickly neutralized French counter-battery fire. The initial assault on Beatrice was swift and brutal. Viet Minh infantry, emerging from their elaborate trench network, swarmed the position. Despite fierce French resistance, the strong point fell within hours, a major blow to French morale, and a clear sign that their defenses were not impregnable. The very next day, March 14th, Diop directed the attack on Gabriel, another key northern strongpoint defended by Algerian tirailleurs. This battle was even more intense, lasting well into the night. French paratroopers were dropped in as reinforcements, but the Viet Minh, showing extraordinary determination, ultimately overwhelmed the defenders. The fall of Gabriel further exposed the vulnerability of the French Central Command post and its vital airfield. These early successes were critical for the Viet Minh, demonstrating their ability to overcome fortified positions and inflicting heavy casualties on the French. However, Diop knew the battle was far from over. The French still held a strong grip on the central airstrip and the main command post, along with numerous other surrounding strongpoints. He also understood the psychological impact these initial victories had on both his own troops and the French. For the Viet Minh, it was a morale booster, validating the immense effort of hauling the artillery and digging the trenches. For the French, it sowed doubt and apprehension. Diop's strategy evolved throughout the battle, adapting to the French response and the changing conditions on the ground. He maintained the pressure on the perimeter, but the core of his approach was to cripple the French supply lines by neutralizing the airfield. French transport planes, primarily Douglas C-47s, were the lifeline for the besieged garrison, bringing in ammunition, food, medical supplies, and reinforcements. The Viet Minh's anti-aircraft batteries, strategically positioned and well camouflaged, began to take a heavy toll on these aircraft. As more planes were shot down or damaged, the French were forced to fly at higher altitudes, making accurate drops increasingly difficult and reducing the volume of supplies reaching the garrison. The siege then settled into a brutal war of attrition, characterized by relentless trench warfare. Diop ordered his forces to extend their network of trenches, slowly creeping closer and closer to the French strongpoints. This boa constrictor tactic gradually strangled the French, denying them maneuver space and making every movement outside their bunkers perilous. The Viet Minh troops, living in the mud and under constant fire, dug deeper and pushed forward, sometimes reaching within a few meters of French positions. Tunnels were dug under French strongpoints, packed with explosives, and detonated, creating breaches for infantry assaults. This was a war of engineers as much as it was of infantry and artillery. French counterattacks, often led by elite paratrooper units, were launched with ferocity, aiming to dislodge the Viet Minh from their newly gained ground or to disrupt the trench network. These counterattacks often resulted in heavy casualties for both sides, but the Viet Minh, with their deep understanding of the terrain and their numerical superiority, consistently managed to hold their gains or quickly recover lost ground. The constant rain, mud, and disease added another layer of misery to the brutal fighting. Conditions for both sides were horrific, but the Viet Minh, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare and accustomed to hardship, were arguably better equipped, mentally and physically, to endure the privations of the prolonged siege. Diop's meticulous planning and the unwavering resolve of his troops were systematically eroding the French defenses. One trench, one strongpoint, one painful meter at a time. The fate of French Indochina, and indeed the future of Vietnam, was being decided in the mud and blood of this remote valley. How much of oneself can be demanded in the name of liberty? As April 1954 wore on, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu found itself in an increasingly desperate situation. V. Nugent Diop's strategy of prolonged siege was proving devastatingly effective. The Viet Minh's relentless artillery bombardment, now largely immune to French counterfire due to their deeply camouflaged positions, systematically pulverized the French. Bunkers collapsed, trenches were obliterated, and communication lines severed. The sheer volume of incoming fire created a hellish environment for the defenders. The French airfield, once their lifeline, was rendered unusable by relentless shelling, forcing all supplies and reinforcements to be paradropped under increasingly perilous conditions. Many drops landed in no man's land, or even within Viet Minh lines. further depleting the already strained French resources. The psychological toll on the French soldiers was immense. Isolated, constantly bombarded, and surrounded by an enemy they could not see, their morale began to fray. Diseases like dysentery and malaria, coupled with the constant lack of sleep and proper nutrition, weakened the garrison. Casualties mounted, and the medical facilities, overwhelmed and under constant fire, struggled to cope. The bravery of individual French soldiers and officers was undeniable, but even their courage could not stem the tide of Giop's methodical destruction. Giop, meanwhile, was relentless. He continued to tighten the noose, ordering his engineers and infantry to push their trenches ever closer to the remaining French positions. The Viet Minh had developed ingenious methods for assaulting the strongpoints, including the use of human wave tactics after concentrated artillery barrages, but also more subtle approaches, like sappers tunneling under key fortifications to detonate explosives. Each assault was meticulously planned, focusing on achieving overwhelming local superiority. Giop understood that even with their numerical advantage, a direct, uncoordinated frontal assault would be too costly. He aimed to achieve maximum damage with minimum loss to his own forces, a difficult balance in such a brutal engagement. The most critical remaining French strongpoints were Eliane II and Eliane IV, guarding the eastern approach to the central command. Post-Giop concentrated his efforts on these crucial positions. The battles for the Eliane Hills were particularly brutal, characterized by hand-to-hand combat, desperate French counterattacks, and relentless Viet Minh assaults. The ground shifted hands multiple times, becoming a gruesome testament to the ferocity of the fighting. The Viet Minh suffered heavy casualties in these assaults, but their numerical superiority and unwavering resolve allowed them to absorb losses that would have broken a lesser army. Giop ensured a continuous flow of fresh troops and supplies to the front lines, relentlessly feeding the battle. Desperate, the French appealed to the United States for intervention. There was consideration within the Eisenhower administration of Operation Vulture, a plan involving massive American airstrikes, possibly even tactical nuclear weapons, to relieve the besieged garrison. However, political support for direct intervention was lacking, particularly from the British, and ultimately, no American military aid beyond material supplies was deployed to alter the course of the battle. The French were left to their fate. By early May, the situation for the French garrison was untenable. Their perimeter had shrunk dramatically, their artillery was almost silenced, and the morale of their exhausted troops was at rock bottom. The Viet Minh, sensing victory, launched their final, decisive assaults. On May 6, Viet Minh forces detonated a massive tunnel charge under Eliane II, blowing a huge crater in the French defenses and paving the way for the final infantry assault. This marked the beginning of the end. The final push on May 7th was overwhelming. French strongpoints fell one by one, often after hours of desperate resistance. The central command post, occupied by General Christian de Castries, was overrun. At 5:30 p.m. on May 7, 1954, the French ceased fighting. The Battle of Yan Bien Phaich was over. The surrender of the French garrison, numbering over 10,000 troops, was an unprecedented humiliation for a major colonial power and a monumental victory for a largely peasant army led by a man with no formal military training. Giop, the former history teacher, had engineered a triumph that would reverberate across the globe. The cost was immense on both sides, with tens of thousands of casualties, but for Vietnam, it was the price paid for self-determination. What echoes of this cost resonate today? The fall of Yan Bien Phaich, on May 7, 1954, sent shockwaves across the world. For V. Nguyen Giop and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, it was an unparalleled triumph, a vindication of their protracted struggle and a testament to the power of a people united in the pursuit of independence. For France, it was a profound and humiliating defeat, marking the undeniable end of its colonial empire in Indochina. The strategic and psychological impact was immediate and far-reaching. News of the surrender reached the Geneva Conference, which had convened in Switzerland just days before the battle concluded. The conference was initially intended to address the Korean War, but it quickly shifted its focus to the future of Indochina. The dramatic turn of events at Yan Bien Phaich irrevocably altered the negotiating dynamic. French diplomatic leverage evaporated, replaced by an urgent need to extricate themselves from a lost war. The Viet Minh, riding the wave of their military victory, came to the negotiating table with unprecedented authority and confidence. The Geneva Accords were signed on July 20, 1954. These agreements formally ended the First Indochina War. Key provisions included a ceasefire across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and the temporary division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by H. Chi Minh, would administer the North, while a non-communist state would govern the South. Crucially, the accords stipulated that nationwide elections would be held in July 1956 to unify the country. This provision, however, would never be fully realized. For Diop and his comrades, the Geneva Accords were a bittersweet outcome. They had achieved military victory, driving out the French, but the country remained divided. While the division was intended to be temporary, the seeds of future conflict were already sown. The United States, having largely supported France, and wary of the spread of communism, refused to sign the Geneva Accords and immediately began to bolster the anti-communist government in South Vietnam. Led by Nguyen Hanh Diem, Washington feared that the proposed 1956 elections, if held, would result in an overwhelming victory for H. Chi Minh, leading to a unified, communist Vietnam. This refusal to acknowledge the Accords' provisions for national elections laid the groundwork for the Second Indochina War, soon to be known as the Vietnam War. Despite the unresolved issue of national reunification, Nguyen Bien Phuoc cemented V. Nguyen Diop's reputation as a military genius. He had defeated a technologically superior Western power using a combination of meticulous planning, innovative logistics, and the unwavering will of a mobilized populace. His victory became a potent symbol for anti-colonial movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, demonstrating that determined indigenous forces could overcome imperial might. It profoundly influenced military thinking, validating the principles of protracted people's war and inspiring future liberation struggles. Diop's tactical brilliance, particularly his ability to adapt his strategy, to leverage the terrain, and to exploit French weaknesses, was studied in military academies worldwide. In the aftermath of the French withdrawal, Diop turned his attention to consolidating power in North Vietnam. He oversaw the integration of regional forces into a unified national army, the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, and directed efforts to rebuild the war-torn country. The focus shifted to economic development, land reform, and the establishment of a socialist state in the North. However, the division at the 17th parallel remained a constant, festering wound. Families were separated, and the ideological chasm between North and South widened. Diop and the North Vietnamese leadership remained committed to the reunification of Vietnam. Viewing the division as an artificial imposition by foreign powers, they understood that the struggle for complete independence was not yet over. The period immediately following Geneva was one of reconstruction in the North, but also one of intense preparation for the inevitable next phase of conflict. The philosophical question, at what cost does victory come, and who bears the true burden of its price, echoed with particular resonance now. Victory had come at an immense human cost, and the burden of its price, a divided nation, was already leading to further shadows of conflict. The rise of Diop and the Viet Minh was complete, but it had laid the foundation for a new, even more devastating chapter in Vietnam's history. The triumph at Dien Bien Phuoc marked the zenith of one struggle, yet simultaneously, it ushered in the prologue to another. The cost of victory was undeniable, measured in human lives and a nation cleaved in two. For Diop, it was a strategic masterpiece, born of profound sacrifice. Now that you know the price, what would you have done to unite a divided nation? Philosophical question: when a nation is torn by ideology and outside influence, what becomes of its soul? The mid-1950s in Vietnam were a period of uneasy peace, a deceptive calm before the storm. The Geneva Accords, intended to unify the nation through elections, quickly unraveled. In the North, Nguyen Giap, now Minister of Defense and Commander-in-Chief of the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, oversaw the consolidation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. His immediate priorities were twofold: to rebuild a nation ravaged by 8 years of war and to prepare for the inevitable future conflict. The PAVN, forged in the crucible of Dien Bien Phuoc, was reorganized and professionalized, transitioning from a primarily guerrilla force into a more conventional army albeit one still rooted in the principles of People's War. Giap emphasized ideological training, discipline, and logistical self-sufficiency. Simultaneously, in the South, the United States actively supported the creation of the Republic of Vietnam under Nguyen H. Diem. Diem, a staunch consolidated his power, often through repressive means, and refused to participate in the nationwide elections stipulated by the Geneva Accords. Washington, fearing a communist victory, backed Diem's stance, arguing that free elections were impossible in the North. This refusal to implement the key provision of the Accords effectively cemented the division of Vietnam and fueled the growing resentment in the North. Giap and the Politburo in Hanoi viewed Diem's regime as a puppet government, an extension of foreign intervention, and the division of their homeland as an intolerable betrayal of the national aspiration for unity. By the late 1950s, the political repression in South Vietnam under Diem intensified. His regime targeted not only former Viet Minh members but also non-communist opposition, leading to widespread discontent. In response, a nascent insurgency began to emerge in the South. Initially, Hanoi's policy was one of political struggle, urging patience and emphasizing the building of socialist strength in the North. However, the increasing repression by Diem and the appeals from Southern communists and former Viet Minh cadres for support began to shift Hanoi's strategy. In 1959, the 15th plenum of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Vietnam, Lao Dong Party, made a crucial decision to formally sanction armed struggle in the South. This marked a pivotal moment, committing North Vietnam to supporting the growing insurgency. Giap was instrumental in planning this shift. The goal was no longer merely political persuasion, but the active preparation for military reunification. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a clandestine network of paths and trails through Laos and Cambodia, which had been used for limited resupply during the First Indochina War, began to be expanded and developed into a sophisticated logistical artery. Trail would become the lifeline of the southern insurgency, allowing the infiltration of men, weapons, and supplies from North Vietnam. The insurgency in the South gained momentum. In December 1960, various Southern revolutionary groups, under Hanoi's guidance, formally established the National Liberation Front, NLF, which the US and South Vietnam derisively called the Viet Cong. The NLF aimed to overthrow the Diem regime and unify Vietnam. It was a broad front, encompassing communists and non-communists, all united by their opposition to Diem and foreign influence. Giap played a key role in providing strategic direction and resources to the NLF, though direct PAVN involvement remained limited in the very early stages. He understood that the NLF's strength lay in its popular appeal and its ability to blend seamlessly with the rural population, that as the insurgency grew, so did the United States involvement. Under Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, American military advisors were sent to South Vietnam in increasing numbers to train and support the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, PAVN. The U.S. provided substantial financial aid and military equipment. The conflict, initially a civil war, began its inexorable transformation into a proxy war between the Cold War superpowers. The philosophical question of a nation torn by ideology and outside influence was no longer abstract. It was being played out with real weapons and real lives. By the early 1960s, the strategic situation was becoming clearer. The North, under Giap's military leadership, was committed to reunification by force if necessary. The South, increasingly propped up by the United States, was determined to maintain its independence from communist rule. The assassination of Nguyen H. Diem in November 1963, with tacit U.S. approval, plunged South Vietnam into a period of political instability, marked by a succession of short-lived military coups. This instability, ironically, strengthened Hanoi's resolve, as they perceived the South Vietnamese government as even weaker and more susceptible to collapse. Giap and the Politburo now saw an opportunity to escalate their efforts, believing that the time was ripe to push for a decisive victory. The path to a full-scale conflict, with the United States directly involved, was now inevitable. The collapse of any hope for a peaceful, unified Vietnam was complete. How does one choose a side when the very ground beneath your feet is divided? The political instability in South Vietnam following the assassination of Nguyen H. Diem Late 1963 was closely observed by Võ Nguyên Giáp and the North Vietnamese leadership in Hanoi. They interpreted the chaos as a sign of the Saigon regime's fundamental weakness and an opportunity to accelerate the struggle for reunification. The strategic decision was made to increase military pressure in the south, primarily through intensified guerrilla warfare conducted by the National Liberation Front (NLF), bolstered by growing infiltration of People's Army of Vietnam (PAVN). Regulars via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Giáp oversaw the logistics and training for this increased infiltration, ensuring a steady flow of men and material to the southern battlefields. For the United States, the deteriorating situation in South Vietnam presented a profound dilemma. The Kennedy administration had steadily increased the number of military advisors, but the scale of the conflict was clearly escalating beyond advisory roles. The Strategic Hamlet Program, designed to isolate the rural population from the NLF, was largely failing. The NLF, meanwhile, was demonstrating remarkable resilience and tactical prowess, inflicting significant defeats on the Army of the Republic of Vietnam (ARVN) at battles like AP back in January 1963. Even against numerically superior forces, these early engagements, though small in scale compared to later battles, underscored the effectiveness of the NLF's guerrilla tactics and the ARVN's shortcomings. The decisive turning point in direct U.S. military involvement came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Allegations of two separate attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats on U.S. Navy destroyers, though the second alleged attack remains highly disputed by historians, provided the catalyst for a significant escalation. President Lyndon B. Johnson, leveraging the incident, secured the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from the U.S. Congress. This resolution granted the President broad authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. It effectively provided a blank check for military intervention without a formal declaration of war. With the legal and political groundwork laid, the United States began a systematic bombing campaign against North Vietnam in March 1965, known as Operation Rolling Thunder. The stated objective was to interdict supply routes, destroy military targets, and break North Vietnam's will to fight. Giáp and the North Vietnamese leadership prepared for this onslaught. They had meticulously built an extensive network of air defenses, including anti-aircraft artillery, and later, surface-to-air missiles SAM supplied by the Soviet Union and China. The skies over North Vietnam became a dangerous zone for American pilots. Despite the immense destructive power of the American Air Force, Operation Rolling Thunder failed to achieve its strategic objectives. North Vietnam's will to fight remained unbroken, and the flow of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, though difficult, continued. Concurrent with the bombing campaign, the United States began deploying large numbers of conventional ground troops to South Vietnam. In March 1965, the first contingent of U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang, marking the official shift from an advisory role to direct combat involvement. By the end of 1965, over 180,000 American troops were in Vietnam, a number that would swell to over 500,000 within a few years. The conflict had fully transformed from an insurgency into a full-scale conventional war with the world's most powerful military. Võ Nguyên Giap's strategic response to this massive American escalation was multifaceted. He understood that a direct conventional confrontation with the U.S. military on its own terms would be catastrophic. Instead, he adhered to the principles of protracted people's war, adapting them to the new enemy. His strategy involved fighting a protracted war of attrition, inflicting steady, heavy casualties on American forces to erode U.S. public and political support for the war, maintaining the initiative through guerrilla warfare, keeping the U.S. forces constantly on edge, forcing them to react to NLF and PAVN actions, rather than dictating the terms of engagement, targeting U.S. logistics and morale, harassing supply lines, striking at bases, and undermining the psychological resilience of American troops, combining political and military struggle, continuing to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese population, while also engaging in armed combat, utilizing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, ensuring the continuous flow of reinforcements and supplies to the south. Despite intense American bombing, The initial major engagements between U.S. forces and the PAVN occurred in the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965. These brutal battles, involving helicopter-borne assault tactics by the U.S. and fierce close-quarters combat by the PAVN, were a taste of the prolonged, bloody conflict to come. While both sides claimed victory, the Ia Drang battles demonstrated that the PAVN could stand and fight against American air mobility and firepower, and that American casualties, while lower than those of the North Vietnamese, would be significant. Giap from Hanoi carefully studied these engagements, refining his tactics and preparing his forces for the long and devastating conflict that lay ahead. The philosophical question of a nation's soul, caught between these colossal ideological and military forces, deepened with every life lost. What does it mean to fight for a soul? As the United States rapidly expanded its military presence in South Vietnam in the mid-1960s, reaching hundreds of thousands of troops by 1967, the strategic reality on the ground became increasingly defined by a fundamental asymmetry. The U.S. military, commanded by General William Westmoreland, pursued a strategy of search and destroy, using superior firepower, mobility, and technology to locate and eliminate Viet Cong and PAVN units in large-scale engagements. This strategy aimed to inflict unsustainable casualties on the enemy, thereby breaking their will to fight. Massive bombing campaigns, extensive use of artillery, and helicopter-borne assaults became hallmarks of the American effort. Vien Giap, from his command in Hanoi, carefully observed these American tactics. He recognized that engaging in large-scale, conventional battles on American terms would be disastrous for the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, and the National Liberation Front, NLF. The U.S. possessed overwhelming advantages in air power, artillery, and logistics. Instead, Giap refined a counter-strategy based on what became known as clinging to the belt. This involved bringing Viet Cong and PAVN units as close as possible to American forces, often fighting at extremely close quarters. The objective was to nullify the devastating effects of U.S. artillery and air support, as these could not be safely used when enemy and friendly forces were intermingled. This tactic also increased American casualties in direct engagements, making the war more costly for the United States. The clinging to the belt strategy exploited the limitations of American military technology and doctrine. It forced U.S. troops into difficult, often protracted, ground combat, negating their overwhelming air and fire superiority. This also increased the psychological pressure on American soldiers, who found themselves in continuous close-quarters combat against an elusive and determined enemy. Giap understood that even if his forces suffered higher absolute casualties in these engagements, the political impact of American losses, particularly fatalities, would be far greater on the U.S. home front. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became the linchpin of Giap's strategy. Despite relentless American bombing, including Operation Rolling Thunder and later Operation Barrel Roll in Laos, the trail continued to function. Thousands of North Vietnamese and NLF cadres, alongside civilian laborers, worked tirelessly to keep the network open, repairing bomb damage, building bypasses, and developing intricate systems of concealed depots and resting points. This logistical masterpiece, often overlooked in its sheer scale and human cost, was crucial for sustaining the fight in the south. It allowed Giap to constantly reinforce his units, replace losses, and escalate the intensity of the insurgency. Without the trail, the protracted war strategy would have been untenable. Throughout the mid-1960s, Giap also directed the expansion of the air defense system in North Vietnam. With significant aid from the Soviet Union and China, North Vietnam acquired sophisticated radar systems, anti-aircraft guns, and SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile SAM batteries. These defenses transformed the skies over North Vietnam into one of the most dangerous aerial combat zones in history. American air losses mounted, increasing the pressure on the U.S. military and contributing to public skepticism about the effectiveness of the bombing campaign. Giap's focus on integrated air defense demonstrated his understanding of asymmetric warfare, countering American technological advantages with clever deployment and persistent effort. The intensity of the ground war escalated. Major battles occurred in remote jungle areas, like the Battle of the Bong Sun Plain in 1966 and Operation Cedar Falls in early 1967, which targeted the Iron Triangle northwest of Saigon. These operations involved massive troop deployments and extensive use of firepower. While U.S. forces often achieved tactical victories, clearing areas and inflicting casualties, the NLF and PAVN units proved remarkably resilient. They would melt away into the jungle or retreat into their elaborate tunnel systems, only to re-emerge and resume operations once the American forces departed. This demonstrated Giap's strategic patience and his force's ability to absorb losses and reconstitute. By 1967, it became clear that the U.S. strategy of attrition was not breaking the will of North Vietnam. Despite the enormous expenditure of resources and the growing number of American casualties, the Viet Cong and PAVN retained their operational capability and popular support in many areas of the South. The war had settled into a brutal, grinding stalemate, defined by the clashing strategies, American technological might versus North Vietnamese protracted warfare and resilience. Giap, understanding the deep divisions emerging in American society over the war, knew that time was on his side. He believed that the human and political cost of the war would eventually become unbearable for the United States, leading to their withdrawal. This unwavering conviction would soon lead to the most audacious and strategically significant offensive of the entire conflict. What do you do when the very measure of success becomes unsustainable? By late 1967, the stalemate in Vietnam had reached a critical juncture. The United States, under General Westmoreland, continued to pursue its strategy of attrition, believing that sustained pressure and mounting casualties would eventually force Hanoi to capitulate. However, anti-war sentiment was growing within the United States, fueled by the seemingly endless nature of the conflict and the rising American death toll. In Hanoi, V. Nugent Giap and the Politburo recognized this growing disquiet in American society. They theorized that a decisive, shocking blow could break the American will to fight and ignite a general uprising among the South Vietnamese population. The plan that emerged from these deliberations was audacious in its scope and immense in its risk. The Tet Offensive. The strategic objectives were multifaceted. Militarily, it aimed to inflict a crippling blow on US and ARVN forces, demonstrating that no part of South Vietnam was safe. Politically, it sought to trigger a popular uprising among the urban population of South Vietnam, who, Hanoi believed, were merely waiting for a signal to overthrow the Saigon regime. Psychologically, it was designed to shatter American public confidence in the war and the optimistic pronouncements of their military and political leaders. Giap, despite some historical debate about his exact role in the final strategic approval, was undeniably central to the meticulous planning and logistical preparations required for such a complex, nationwide offensive. The timing of the offensive was chosen for maximum impact. The Tet, Holiday Lunar New Year, a traditional period of ceasefire and celebration in Vietnam. This element of surprise was crucial. While American and ARVN forces anticipated some increase in activity, they did not foresee the scale and coordination of the coming attacks. For months leading up to Tet, the Viet Cong and PAVN engaged in a massive, clandestine buildup of men and material, moving weapons, ammunition, and troops into position in and around South Vietnamese cities, often using hidden tunnels and civilian transport. On January 30th to 31st, 1968, the Tet Offensive exploded across South Vietnam. Simultaneous attacks were launched against hundreds of towns and cities, military installations, and government buildings. Targets included the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, the Presidential Palace, and major air bases. The sheer audacity and coordination of the attacks stunned American and South Vietnamese commanders. The fighting was fierce and widespread, bringing the brutal reality of the war directly into urban centers that had largely been spared until then. In the capital, Saigon, Viet Cong sapper teams penetrated the outer walls of the U.S. Embassy, engaging in a 6-hour firefight with U.S. Marines before being repelled. While the embassy was never fully occupied, the images of fighting within the heart of American power in Saigon resonated powerfully on television screens across the globe, undermining the narrative of an enemy on the verge of defeat. In Hue, the former imperial capital, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces seized control of large parts of the city and held it for nearly a month. The subsequent battle to retake Hue was one of the longest and bloodiest of the war. resulting in massive destruction and a high civilian death toll. The discovery of mass graves containing thousands of civilians executed by the Viet Cong further underscored the brutal nature of the conflict. From a purely military perspective, the Tet Offensive was a costly defeat for the Viet Cong and PAVN. They suffered enormous casualties, estimated to be tens of thousands, including a significant portion of their elite, Viet Cong cadre. The popular uprising they had hoped for did not materialize in the cities, and the South Vietnamese people, largely, did not rise up to support them. American and ARVN forces, despite being caught by surprise, ultimately repelled the attacks and inflicted heavy losses. However, GIOP and the North Vietnamese leadership had always understood that the strategic objective of Tet was not solely military. It was primarily psychological and political, aimed at undermining American will. In this regard, the Tet Offensive was a resounding success. The scale and ferocity of the attacks shattered the American public's perception that the war was being won or was nearing an end. General Westmoreland's repeated assurances of light at the end of the tunnel were exposed as tragically optimistic. News coverage, particularly on television, brought the carnage and chaos of the war directly into American living rooms, profoundly impacting public opinion. Support for the war plummeted, and a deep credibility gap opened between the government and the American people. The philosophical question, when a nation is torn by ideology and outside influence, what becomes of its soul, was now being answered, painfully, not just in Vietnam, but within American society itself. The collapse of the American political consensus for the war had begun. How do illusions about conflict truly shatter? The immediate aftermath of the Tet Offensive, while a military defeat for the Viet Cong and PAVN triggered a profound political crisis within the United States, the images of fighting in Saigon, the prolonged battle for Hue, and the sheer audacity of the enemy attacks directly contradicted the optimistic assessments previously delivered by the Johnson administration and military leadership. Television, news, notably the commentary of respected anchorman Walter Cronkite, questioned the viability of the American effort, famously stating that the war seemed mired in stalemate. This public pronouncement, from a figure often described as the most trusted man in America, reflected a rapidly shifting national mood. President Lyndon B. Johnson, deeply affected by the public backlash and the mounting political pressure, announced on March 31, 1968, that he would not seek re-election. This decision was a direct consequence of the Tet Offensive's impact on American domestic politics. It underscored Vien Nguyen GIOP's strategic foresight. The true battleground was not just in Vietnam, but in the living rooms and public discourse of America. The objective of breaking the American will, rather than their military capacity, had been achieved. General William Westmoreland was soon relieved of his command, replaced by General Creighton Abrams, signaling a shift in American military strategy. General Abrams moved away from the search and destroy strategy towards a focus on pacification and Vietnamization. Pacification aimed to secure and stabilize rural areas, protecting the population from Viet Cong influence and building the capacity of the South Vietnamese government and military. Vietnamization, the brainchild of the incoming Nixon administration, aimed to gradually withdraw American combat troops while simultaneously building up the strength and capability of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, to enable them to fight the war on their own. This shift represented an acknowledgement by the US that a purely military solution, using overwhelming force, was not working. For GIOP and the North Vietnamese leadership, the change in American strategy presented new challenges and opportunities. They recognized that Vietnamization was a veiled attempt at American disengagement, but it also meant that PAVN would increasingly face the ARVN rather than the full might of the US military. This was a favorable development, as the ARVN, despite American training and equipment, still lacked the cohesion, morale, and unified command structure of the PAVN. GIOP continued to emphasize the crucial role of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, knowing that sustained pressure in the south depended entirely on the continuous flow of supplies and reinforcements. The period from late 1968 through the early 1970s was characterized by a grinding war of attrition, with major conventional battles often occurring in the border regions of Laos and Cambodia, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail snaked through neutral territory. American and ARVN forces launched incursions into these sanctuaries. Operation Menu secret bombing of Cambodia, 1969 to 1970, and Operation Lam Son 719 ARVN incursion into Laos, 1971, attempting to disrupt the trail and destroy PAVN supply depots. These operations, while inflicting some damage, failed to permanently sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The PAVN, under GOP's strategic direction, proved incredibly adept at adapting, building new routes, and defending their logistical arteries. Inside South Vietnam, the NLF, though severely weakened by the losses of the Tet Offensive, slowly rebuilt its strength, often relying more heavily on PAVN regulars for direct combat roles. The North Vietnamese strategy remained consistent, maintained military pressure, forced the US to expend resources and lives, and undermined the legitimacy of the Saigon regime. GOP understood that the ultimate victory would come not from a single decisive battle, but from the cumulative effect of continuous struggle, eroding the enemy's will and capacity to fight. As American troop withdrawals gained momentum, the war's focus increasingly shifted towards air power and the strengthening of the ARVN. However, the South Vietnamese government remained riddled with corruption and internal divisions. The philosophical question of a nation's soul, torn by ideology and outside influence, was now being debated fiercely in Washington, D.C., as much as in Hanoi. The collapse of American public consensus for the war was irreversible, paving the way for eventual withdrawal, but the path to that withdrawal would still be paved with immense suffering and bloodshed. GOP watched these developments with a calculated patience, preparing for the final phase of the conflict, knowing that the decisive engagements, though still uncertain, were drawing closer. In the slow dance of withdrawal, what truly remains. By the early 1970s, as American ground forces continued their phased withdrawal from Vietnam under President Richard Nixon's Vietnamization policy, V. Nugent GOP and the North Vietnamese leadership in Hanoi recognized a narrowing window of opportunity. They understood that the Saigon regime, despite significant American aid and training, remained structurally weak and reliant on external support. The moment for a decisive offensive, designed to test the viability of Vietnamization and pressure the United States into a final disengagement, was approaching. In March 1972, GOP, although he had transitioned some direct operational command to his deputy Van Tindung, was still the supreme strategic architect behind the Easter Offensive Chin, Dutch Truong Hay, 1972. This was a massive three-pronged conventional invasion of South Vietnam by the People's Army of Vietnam PAVN, involving tanks, heavy artillery, and large infantry formations, a significant departure from previous guerrilla-centric operations. The main thrusts were directed at Quang Tri Province in the north, the Central Highlands Kontum, and the area north of Saigon and O Loc. The offensive aimed to achieve three key objectives: demonstrate the failure of Vietnamization, draw the ARVN into conventional battles where PAVN's newly acquired firepower could be decisive, and create a strong position for Hanoi at the ongoing Paris peace talks. The scale and intensity of the Easter Offensive initially caught the United States and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam (ARVN) by surprise. PAVN forces quickly overran several ARVN outposts and made significant territorial gains, particularly in Quang Tri Province. The offensive marked a brutal new phase of the war, characterized by conventional tank battles and extensive use of heavy artillery. Resembling European battlefields more than the jungle skirmishes of earlier years, the ARVN, however, fought with surprising resilience in some areas, particularly at Kontum and An OAC, where they received crucial and often devastating U.S. air support. President Nixon responded to the offensive with unprecedented force, unleashing Operation Linebacker I, a massive aerial bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Unlike the earlier Operation Rolling Thunder, Linebacker I employed advanced precision munitions and was unrestricted in its targeting, hitting military and industrial targets, as well as transportation infrastructure in and around Hanoi and Hue. This bombing campaign, coupled with the mining of North Vietnamese harbors, inflicted severe damage on North Vietnam's economy and military infrastructure, disrupting supply lines for the offensive. Despite the heavy American bombing and fierce ARVN resistance, the Easter Offensive achieved some strategic successes for Hanoi, while it failed to trigger a general uprising or topple the Saigon regime. It demonstrated that the ARVN could not defend itself without substantial U.S. air support. More importantly, it forced the United States to the negotiating table with a greater sense of urgency. The high cost of the offensive for the PAVN, however, with tens of thousands of casualties and significant equipment losses, also showed the limitations of direct conventional confrontation against a determined defense backed by overwhelming air power. The military and political pressures ultimately led to intense negotiations in Paris. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed by the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government representing the NF. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all remaining American combat troops, the release of prisoners of war, and a political process for the peaceful reunification of Vietnam. Crucially for GIOP and Hanoi, the accords allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain in place in South Vietnam, legitimizing their presence there. For the United States, it offered a peace with honor and an exit from a deeply unpopular war. The signing of the Paris Peace Accords marked the official end of direct American military involvement in Vietnam. The last American combat troops departed in March 1973. For GIOP, this was a momentous victory, the culmination of decades of struggle against foreign intervention. The philosophical question when a nation is torn by ideology and outside influence, what becomes of its soul, seemed, in this moment, to lean towards the triumph of a unified national will, even if achieved through brutal conflict. However, the peace was fragile. The accords were a ceasefire, not a genuine end to the conflict. Both North and South Vietnam immediately began violating the terms, and the Civil War, now without direct American combat participation, resumed. With renewed ferocity, the stage was set for the final, decisive chapter. As the South Vietnamese government faced its ultimate test without its primary benefactor, the collapse of American military involvement had created a vacuum that both sides immediately sought to fill. The Tet Offensive, the Easter Offensive, and finally the Paris Accords marked the collapse of one phase of conflict, a testament to GIOP's relentless strategy that outlasted and outwilled a global superpower. Yet, the price of this political shift, of a war evolving, was a nation still fractured, bleeding, and awaiting its final, brutal reunification. Now, seeing the cost of political maneuvering, would your resolve remain unbroken? Philosophical question. In the shadow of ultimate victory, what burdens does the victor assume, and what truths are forged in the final fires of conflict? The signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, while ending direct American military involvement, did not bring peace to Vietnam. For V. Nguyen Giap and the North Vietnamese leadership, the withdrawal of U.S. combat troops was the realization of a long-held strategic objective. They viewed the accords not as a definitive end to the conflict, but as a crucial step towards the ultimate reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The peace was merely a tactical pause, a necessary transition before the final push. The People's Army of Vietnam (PAVN) and the National Liberation Front (NLF) immediately began to consolidate their positions in the south, extending their control over new territories and improving their logistical networks along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam (ARVN), now solely responsible for the defense of South Vietnam, found itself in a precarious position. Despite extensive American training and billions of dollars in equipment, its morale was fragile, its leadership often corrupt, and its dependence on U.S. air power deeply ingrained. The departure of American forces left a profound psychological void. The South Vietnamese government, under President Nguyen Van Thieu, continued to receive significant military and financial aid from the U.S., but the direct combat support, particularly critical air cover, was gone. Though increasingly in a supervisory and advisory role rather than direct battlefield command due to health and age, remained the strategic mastermind behind the Politburo's plans. He understood that the ARVN's greatest weakness was its inability to fight a sustained, independent war without the colossal backing of the United States. He directed the PAVN to exploit this vulnerability, maintaining constant pressure along the ceasefire lines, probing ARVN defenses, and preparing for a final, decisive offensive. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was transformed into a sophisticated logistical highway, capable of moving entire divisions, complete with tanks, heavy artillery, and trucks. directly into South Vietnam. This massive logistical buildup, conducted largely unhindered by American air power after 1973, was a testament to GEOP's long-standing emphasis on supply and infrastructure. Throughout 1973 and 1974, low-level fighting intensified across South Vietnam. Both sides routinely violated the Paris Accords. The PAVN steadily chipped away at ARVN control, launching local offensives to seize strategic territory and improve their staging grounds for a larger campaign. The ARVN, despite its numerical strength and modern weaponry, often found itself on the defensive, unable to effectively counter the disciplined and highly motivated PAVN units. Inflation and economic instability in South Vietnam further eroded public confidence in the Saigon government. By late 1974, the North Vietnamese leadership was confident that the conditions for a final offensive were ripe. They had successfully built up their forces in the south, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was fully operational, and the U.S., grappling with the Watergate scandal and domestic economic woes, showed no inclination to re-engage militarily in Vietnam. GEOP and his colleagues developed Campaign 275, which would eventually become the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, aimed at the complete liberation of South Vietnam. The plan called for a series of coordinated attacks, initially targeting the Central Highlands, then pushing rapidly south toward Saigon. The objective was to achieve victory within 2 years. By 1976, the offensive began in earnest in early March 1975, with a surprise attack on Buon Ma Thuot, a strategically important city in the Central Highlands. The speed and decisiveness of the PAVN victory at Buon Ma Thuot stunned the ARVN. President Thieu, in a catastrophic strategic miscalculation, ordered a hasty withdrawal of ARVN forces from the Central Highlands and the northern provinces, hoping to consolidate his forces closer to Saigon. This retreat, however, quickly devolved into a chaotic rout. Roads became choked with fleeing soldiers and civilians, creating an immense humanitarian crisis and leaving vast amounts of valuable military equipment abandoned. The collapse of the ARVN's northern and central defenses was far more rapid and complete than even GEOP had anticipated. The retreat became a cascade, and what was envisioned as a 2-year campaign suddenly appeared achievable in mere weeks. GEOP from Hanoi urged his commanders in the field to exploit the momentum, emphasizing speed and decisive action. The philosophical question of the victor assuming burdens was becoming very real, as the swift collapse meant managing a rapid, large-scale advance and preparing for the final, possibly bloody, confrontation for the capital itself. The resistance of the South Vietnamese state, for all its American backing, was crumbling with astonishing speed, paving the way for the ultimate test of GOP's lifelong struggle. When the last line breaks, what holds a people together? The ARVN retreat from the Central Highlands in March 1975, initiated by President Thieu's order to consolidate forces, turned into a full-blown catastrophe. Roads leading east towards the coast were choked with fleeing soldiers, their families, and desperate civilians. Discipline evaporated. Tanks, artillery pieces, and vast quantities of American-supplied equipment were abandoned or fell into the hands of the advancing People's Army of Vietnam (PAVN). This unexpectedly swift disintegration of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam's ARVN, northern and central front lines, astonished even Vientiane, GEOP, and the North Vietnamese Politburo in Hanoi. What they had envisioned as a 2-year campaign now seemed achievable in a matter of weeks. GEOP, though increasingly delegating operational command to General Van Tindung, remained the strategic mind guiding the final push. He immediately grasped the unprecedented opportunity. Orders were issued to exploit the panic and accelerate the advance. The objective shifted from a phased campaign to a rapid, decisive strike on Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The final phase of the offensive was renamed the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, a symbolic nod to the deceased revolutionary leader and a clear statement of ultimate intent, complete national liberation and reunification. The PAVN's advance was relentless, spearheaded by tanks and armored personnel carriers, and supported by heavy artillery. North Vietnamese forces bypassed pockets of resistance, focusing on speed and enveloping key objectives. Cities and provinces fell one after another. Huc, the ancient imperial capital, in late March. Da Nang, the major port city and former U.S. base, in early April. accompanied by scenes of immense chaos as thousands attempted to flee by sea. The fall of Da Nang, in particular, was a psychological blow, illustrating the total collapse of order and the ineffectiveness of the ARVN's defense. The United States, watching from afar, was paralyzed. President Gerald Ford, who had assumed office after Nixon's resignation, faced a Congress and public weary of Vietnam and unwilling to commit further resources or troops. Appeals from Saigon for emergency military aid were largely denied. The philosophical thread of the victor assuming burdens now manifested as the crushing burden of abandonment for the South Vietnamese. As their former ally watched the final collapse unfold, the American embassy in Saigon, under Ambassador Graham Martin, began contingency planning for the evacuation of American personnel and at-risk South Vietnamese. By mid-April, PAVN forces were closing in on Saigon. The last remaining ARVN resistance was concentrated around the capital. President Thieu resigned on April 21st, delivering a bitter farewell speech denouncing the United States for its failure to honor its commitments. He then fled the country. His departure further demoralized the already collapsing ARVN. A brief transitional government under General Dajong Van Min attempted to negotiate a ceasefire, but Hanoi's terms were unambiguous: unconditional surrender. On April 29, 1975, as PAVN artillery pounded the outskirts of Saigon, the United States launched Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Thousands of American civilians and South Vietnamese, desperate to escape the impending communist takeover, flocked to the U.S. Embassy compound and other designated pickup points. Images of helicopters lifting off from the embassy rooftop, crowded with people, became enduring symbols of the end of the American era in Vietnam and the chaotic finale of a decades-long conflict. The very next day, April 30, 1975, PAVN tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The flag of the Provisional Revolutionary Government was raised. General Dajong Van Min announced the unconditional surrender of the Republic of Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Campaign had achieved its objective. The Vietnam War, known in Vietnam as the American War, was officially over. For Vien Nguyen Giop, it was the culmination of a lifetime devoted to the cause of Vietnamese independence and reunification. He had outmaneuvered, outlasted, and ultimately defeated three powerful adversaries: the French, the Japanese, and the Americans, leading a largely peasant army to victory against overwhelming technological and economic might. The human cost of this triumph, however, was immeasurable, a truth forged in the final fires of conflict. The nation was unified, but the scars ran deep. After all is lost, what is truly left to defend? The fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, was not merely a military victory. It was the ultimate vindication of Vien Nguyen Giop's strategic doctrine and the decades-long struggle for Vietnamese independence and reunification. The image of North Vietnamese tanks breaking through the gates of the presidential palace, now known as the Independence Palace, symbolized the complete triumph of the revolution. Giop, though not personally in Saigon at that moment, was the architect whose long-term vision and patient execution had brought about this historic conclusion. For the Vietnamese people, it marked the end of over a century of foreign domination, from French colonialism to Japanese occupation and, finally, American intervention. The victory, however, came at an unimaginable cost. The 3 decades of continuous warfare had ravaged Vietnam. Estimates vary, but millions of Vietnamese lives were lost, soldiers and civilians alike, from all sides of the conflict. The landscape was scarred by bombs, defoliants like Agent Orange, and unexploded ordnance. Infrastructure was decimated, and the economy lay in ruins. The deep social and political divisions that had fueled the war, particularly between North and South, would not magically disappear with reunification. The philosophical question, in the shadow of ultimate victory, what burdens does the victor assume, and what truths are forged in the final fires of conflict, resonated with grim clarity. The victory was immense, but so too was the burden of reconstruction and reconciliation for Giop. The victory solidified his place in history as one of the 20th century's most brilliant military commanders. His methods of protracted people's war, blending political struggle with military action, exploiting the enemy's weaknesses, and leveraging popular support, became a blueprint for revolutionary movements worldwide. his capacity for meticulous planning, strategic patience, and tactical adaptation. From the early days of building a few armed propaganda teams to commanding a modern army capable of defeating a superpower, demonstrated a genius rare in military history. He proved that ideological commitment and the will of a unified people could overcome overwhelming technological and material superiority internationally. The fall of Saigon had profound implications. It was seen as a major defeat for the United States and a clear limitation on the efficacy of military power in asymmetrical conflicts. It sparked intense debate within American society about the use of force, the role of intervention, and the nature of Cold War foreign policy. For the Soviet Union and China, it was a geopolitical triumph, demonstrating the viability of supporting liberation movements. For other developing nations and anti-colonial struggles, it was an immense source of inspiration, proving that independence could be won against even the most formidable odds. In Vietnam, the newly unified nation faced the daunting task of reconstruction and the imposition of a socialist system across the entire country. The immediate aftermath saw the establishment of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. While many in the South initially hoped for reconciliation, the reality was often harsh. Re-education camps were established for former PAVN soldiers and South Vietnamese officials, and widespread collectivization policies were implemented. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, particularly those associated with the former Saigon regime, fled the country by boat, becoming boat people, seeking refuge from political persecution and economic hardship. This exodus underscored the deep ideological and social divisions that the war had created. Even in victory, Giap remained a prominent figure in the post-war government, though his direct influence on day-to-day military affairs began to wane as he entered his later years. He continued to serve as Minister of Defense until 1980 and held various other high-ranking political positions. However, the period of peace brought new challenges that differed significantly from the wartime struggles. Economic development, diplomatic relations, and navigating the complex currents of the Cold War without direct conflict required different skills than those of a revolutionary general. The truths forged in the final fires of conflict included the painful recognition that achieving peace and prosperity after such a devastating war was a struggle almost as challenging as the war itself. The nation had resisted and won, but the aftermath was far from simple. Now that the flags are raised and the guns are silent, what does a nation truly inherit? Philosophical question. Can the echoes of conflict ever truly fade, or do they forever shape the landscape of memory and identity? The immediate jubilation that followed the reunification of Vietnam in April 1975 gradually gave way to the immense challenges of governing a unified nation. Nugent Giap, the celebrated military genius, remained a revered figure, a living legend who had led the People's Army of Vietnam (PAVN) to victory against three formidable foreign powers. However, the dynamics of peace were vastly different from those of war. The political landscape shifted, and the immediate post-war period was dominated by the consolidation of socialist rule and the daunting task of national reconstruction. Giap, while retaining his position as Minister of National Defense and a member of the Politburo, found his direct influence on policy decisions gradually diminishing as new leaders and new priorities emerged. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam, proclaimed in 1976, faced profound internal divisions. The ideological chasm between the North, hardened by decades of socialist struggle, and the South, with its residual capitalist structures and a population deeply traumatized by the war and often distrustful of Hanoi, was immense. The government initiated ambitious programs to collectivize agriculture and nationalize industry in the South, often leading to economic dislocation and widespread resentment. Former PAVN soldiers, government officials, and those perceived as collaborating with the previous regime were sent to re-education camps, a system that profoundly affected hundreds of thousands of individuals and families. This period marked a difficult chapter of internal resistance for many in the South, as they adapted, or struggled to adapt, to the new political and economic realities. Economically, Vietnam was in dire straits. Decades of conflict had ravaged its infrastructure, farmlands, and industrial capacity. The withdrawal of American aid to the South, coupled with the inherent difficulties of transitioning to a centrally planned economy, led to widespread poverty and food shortages. International relations were also complex. While supported by the Soviet Union and its allies, Vietnam found itself isolated from many Western nations, particularly the United States, which imposed an economic embargo. The relationship with China, once a crucial ally, also began to deteriorate, fueled by historical animosities, ideological differences, and territorial disputes. The tension with China escalated into open conflict. In late 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia to overthrow the brutal Khmer Rouge regime, which had launched cross-border attacks on Vietnamese territory and massacred ethnic Vietnamese. This intervention, while ending the Cambodian genocide, was viewed by China as a proxy war and a challenge to its regional influence. In response, China launched a punitive invasion of northern Vietnam in February 1979. Known as the Sino-Vietnamese War, Võ Nguyên Giáp, though not directly commanding the front lines, played a crucial advisory role, leveraging his deep understanding of Chinese military tactics and border defense. The PAVN, hardened by years of war against the Americans, put up a fierce resistance, inflicting heavy casualties on the Chinese forces. After a month of intense fighting, China withdrew, declaring its punitive mission accomplished, but suffering significant losses. This conflict, largely overshadowed by the Vietnam War, further cemented Vietnam's image as a resilient and militarily capable nation, but also underscored the immense burden of its geopolitical position. Despite his wartime glories, Giap's influence within the Politburo waned throughout the 1980s. He was eventually removed from the Politburo in 1982 and retired as Minister of National Defense in 1980, though he retained honorary positions. This marginalization was attributed to various factors, including his perceived independence, his critique of certain economic policies, and the desire of younger leaders to emerge. However, he remained a respected and beloved figure among the Vietnamese people, revered for his instrumental role in achieving national independence. His public appearances always drew immense crowds, a testament to his enduring popularity. The Vietnamese government, grappling with economic stagnation and international isolation, eventually initiated a series of economic reforms in 1986, known as GMGI renovation. These reforms embraced market principles, opened Vietnam to foreign investment, and gradually integrated the country into the global economy. This period marked a significant shift away from strict central planning, aiming to lift Vietnam out of poverty and accelerate development. The decision to undertake GMGI, while necessary, also brought its own challenges, including social inequality and cultural shifts. The echoes of conflict were still present, but the nation was moving, however hesitantly, towards a different future, attempting to forge a new identity beyond the shadow of war. Giap, in his retirement, witnessed these transformations, the building of a different kind of Vietnam than the one he had fought so hard to unify. In the quiet of peace, what new battles begin? In his later decades, from the 1980s through the early 21st century, Võ Nguyên Giáp lived a life of quiet reflection and continued, though less direct, engagement with his nation's trajectory. Having relinquished his formal positions in the highest echelons of power, he became a revered elder statesman, a living embodiment of Vietnam's struggle for independence. His residence in Hanoi became a place of pilgrimage for veterans, foreign dignitaries, and scholars eager to meet the legendary general who had defeated two colonial powers and the United States. He spent his time writing, reflecting on the wars, and offering insights when consulted by the government. Though his direct policy influence had waned, Giap's writings in this period, particularly his memoirs and analyses of the wars, offered invaluable perspectives on his strategic thinking and the monumental challenges faced by the Vietnamese Revolution. He consistently emphasized the principles of People's War, arguing that the true strength of a nation lay in the unity and will of its people. He spoke about the importance of combining political and military struggle, of adapting to the enemy's strengths, and of patient, protracted warfare to wear down a stronger adversary. His legacy was cemented not just in victory, but in his articulation of a coherent military doctrine that resonated far beyond Vietnam's borders. As Vietnam's borders drawn through the GMGI reforms, Giap witnessed a nation grappling with the complexities of economic liberalization and increasing engagement with the global community. The country experienced rapid economic growth, lifting millions out of poverty, Yet this also brought new social challenges, including growing inequality and environmental concerns. The philosophical question, can the echoes of conflict ever truly fade, or do they forever shape the landscape of memory and identity, remained profoundly relevant. The war's legacy was omnipresent, in the physical scars on the land, in the lasting effects of Agent Orange, and in the deep emotional and psychological wounds carried by generations of Vietnamese Giop, for his part, maintained a dignified silence on many contemporary political issues, but he did occasionally voice concerns, particularly regarding environmental protection and social justice. His public statements often carried immense moral weight, drawing on his authority as a national hero. He met with numerous former adversaries, including former American soldiers and officials, fostering a spirit of reconciliation that transcended the bitterness of past conflicts. These meetings were often poignant, bridging immense divides through shared experiences and a mutual respect for the human cost of war. He was a figure who could look back at the immense sacrifices with unwavering conviction, yet also acknowledge the profound suffering that had been endured. His 100th birthday in 2011 was a national event, a testament to his iconic status. He received countless well-wishes from around the world, reinforcing his image as a symbol of Vietnamese resilience and ingenuity. Even in his advanced age, his mind remained sharp, and his presence continued to inspire. He represented a direct link to the founding fathers of modern Vietnam, a tangible connection to the epic struggle for independence that defined the nation. Vien Nguyen Giop passed away on October 4, 2013, at the age of 102. His death marked the end of an era. The nation mourned profoundly. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lined the streets of Hanoi for his funeral procession, paying their final respects to the general who had led them to victory. His funeral was a state event, attended by national leaders and international dignitaries, but it was the outpouring of grief and respect from ordinary citizens that truly underscored his place in the nation's heart. He was buried in his home province of Quang Binh, overlooking the sea, a final resting place for a man who had profoundly shaped Vietnam's destiny. His legacy is multifaceted. He is remembered as the architect of the victories against France and the United States, a brilliant self-taught military strategist whose understanding of people's war proved insurmountable for conventional armies. Beyond his military prowess, he is celebrated as a devoted patriot who dedicated his entire life to the cause of Vietnamese independence. His life intertwined inextricably with the most tumultuous period of modern Vietnamese history, a period of immense suffering and ultimate triumph. The echoes of conflict continue to shape Vietnam's identity, influencing its foreign policy, its national narrative, and the collective memory of its people. Giop's life, more than any other, embodies this enduring legacy, a powerful reminder of what was fought for, and at what cost. Do the ripples of history ever truly cease? The passing of Võ Nguyên Giáp in 2013 closed a chapter, but his legacy, the echoes of the conflicts he orchestrated, continue to profoundly shape Vietnam's identity and its place in the modern world. The principles of protracted peoples war that GOP championed remain central to Vietnamese military doctrine, albeit adapted to contemporary geopolitical realities. The notion of national unity and self-reliance, forged in the crucible of war, continues to be a cornerstone of the nation's political philosophy. Vietnam, having emerged from decades of conflict, now navigates a complex world, balancing its socialist political system with a dynamic, market-oriented economy. Vietnam's economic transformation since the GMG reforms has been remarkable. From being one of the poorest nations, it has achieved significant growth, becoming a prominent manufacturing hub and a rising middle-income country. This economic success, however, is invariably linked to the stability and independence secured through the wars. The ability to chart its own course, free from foreign domination, was the ultimate prize Giop fought for, and it is this hard-won sovereignty that allowed the nation to pursue its own developmental path. The collective memory of the struggle, and the immense sacrifices made, underpins a strong sense of national pride and a cautious approach to international relations, particularly with larger powers. The lingering effects of the war, however, are still deeply felt. The environmental devastation from unexploded ordnance, Agent Orange, and widespread bombing continues to pose significant challenges to public health and land use. Millions of Vietnamese live with disabilities and illnesses attributed to Agent Orange, and efforts to clean up contaminated sites are ongoing. The psychological scars of the conflict, the loss of loved ones, and the trauma of displacement resonate through generations. Reconciliation efforts, both internally and with former adversaries, continue to unfold, often in quiet, personal ways, as the nation seeks to heal. The question of memory and identity, particularly for the Vietnamese diaspora and those in the South who experienced reunification differently, remains a complex and evolving narrative. Giap's impact extends beyond military strategy and national identity. He stands as a symbol of defiance against colonial and imperial power, inspiring countless movements for self-determination globally. His ability to mobilize and sustain a peasant army against technologically superior foes forced military strategists around the world to reevaluate their assumptions about warfare. The lessons of Vietnam, shaped by Giap's strategic genius, became mandatory studies in military academies and political science departments, influencing counterinsurgency doctrines and theories of asymmetric warfare for decades to come. As Vietnam moves further into the 21st century, the direct experience of the wars is fading with the passing of the generation who fought them. Younger generations, born into peace and prosperity, confront new challenges: climate change, global economic competition, and the complexities of maintaining national sovereignty in an interconnected world. Yet, the foundations laid by Giap and his comrades, the independent state, the spirit of resilience, and the deeply ingrained national consciousness forged in struggle, remain central to how Vietnam perceives itself and its future. The echoes of conflict, the central philosophical question of this narrative, never truly fade. They shape monuments and museums, inform educational curricula, and ripple through family stories and collective memory. They contribute to a unique national character marked by resilience, patience, and an unwavering commitment to self-determination. The landscape of memory and identity in Vietnam is irrevocably shaped by the historical events Giap navigated and defined. His life story is not just a chronicle of military victories, but a profound testament to the enduring power of human will in the face of overwhelming adversity. The legacy of VN Nugent Giap is woven into the very fabric of modern Vietnam, nation forged in fire, shaped by an unwavering will, and forever marked by the ultimate triumph over overwhelming odds. The echoes of conflict, of sacrifice, and of an extraordinary perseverance resonate in every facet of its journey. Now that you know this story, what part of its echo will you carry forward?